Thanks, Alex. Okay, I'm just thinking we're probably ready to make a slow but confident start. So I'm going to start off by introducing myself. My name is Alex, and I'm the Kensington co-president at the Students' Union, the Royal College of Art Students' Union, in case anyone's joining us who's not part of the Royal College of Art. Thank you so much to all of you who are joining us tonight for this event. And thank you so much to our wonderful panelists of Borderlines. So I'm going to just make a very quick introduction of everyone, and then our panelists will speak about their practices, what it is that they do, how are they creatively or socially or politically engaged. So we have joining us tonight Charles Heller, co-director of Forensic Oceanography Project, which is affiliated with Forensic Architecture. We have Sanaz, who is here on behalf of Unis Resist Borders, and that is a migrant-led national campaign focused on campaigning on behalf of students and universities in the realm of migration. And we have Xavier or Zav de Souza of Migrants and Culture, a network of migrants organizing for migrant safety, agency, and solidarity in the culture sector. So now we're going to go to the panelists presenting their practices, and I think we're just going to preserve the same order. And also at the end, we're going to have a bit of a Q&A as well. So if you have any questions, my colleague Alex Colshaw is operating the chat, so you'll be able to submit them at the end. So we're going to go to Charles first. Hi, Charles. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, Alex, and really happy to join you all this evening. I'm going to show a few slides, so bear with me while I share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides okay? Great. So as you mentioned, I co-direct this project called Forensic Oceanography, which is based at Goldsmiths and affiliated with the Forensic Architecture Agency. And I initiated this project nearly 10 years ago, in fact, with my colleague Lorenzo Pizzani, when we were both doing our PhD at Goldsmiths at the time. And essentially the project has developed, new methodologies to try to document, account for, and seek to contest as well the violations of migrants' rights across the Mediterranean frontier. And so this has, our reports have served as the basis for a number of legal cases in front of different national, European, or UN courts, so over the last years. But beyond that, we're also involved in a number of different initiatives. We also contributed to found the Watch the Med platform, out of which grew, if you will, a project called the Watch the Med Alarm Phone, which I'll mention a little bit later on, a 24/7 operating emergency hotline for migrants crossing the sea. And I'm also part of the board of a Euro-African network called Migrant, which some of you might know, which was founded along the imperative, if you will, to map and denounce camps for migrants, both within and at the borders of Europe. So what I'd like to do this evening is talk to you a little bit about the Mediterranean frontier and the shifting front line, if you will, at sea that opposes bordering practices and the movements of migrants and movements of solidarity as well. But before that, I'd like to, talk a little bit about at least the way I understand borders operating in the world today, right? So our panel is called Border Lines, right? If I'm not mistaken. But a number of philosophers, various scholars have shown that, of course, borders are not reducible to the legal perimeter surrounding and delimiting nation states. And Etienne Balibar, in particular, a philosopher who was really influential for us and many others, argued long ago that borders are overdetermined, i.e., they don't concern and affect everyone in the same way, i.e., the way they shape our lives is very much shaped by citizenship, but also race, class, and also, in fact, gender. If you will, borders are world configuring. They create a global political geography, but they also distribute unevenly the access to the right to mobility, but also the access to all sorts of other rights that, you know, is evident from simply the global inequality that we observe today. So this has led many, including Etienne Balibar, but many other scholars as well, Ghassan Haga recently in particular, to speak of a global apartheid, right? Where somehow the racial boundaries that shaped the apartheid regime in South Africa, but also colonial cities, think, for example, of Algeria, have somehow been scaled up to global space. Now, the citizens of the global South, who are those who are the most denied the right to move across international borders, have not been, if you will, the passive recipients of this unequal attribution, allocation of the right to move. And they've, in fact, the denial of the freedom to move has not resulted in the end of so-called unwanted migration, but in the illegalization of the movements of migrants from the global South, and the emergence of what I call a mobility conflict, which opposes restrictive policies from implemented by states of the global North, which you see somehow mapped here, and the movements of migrants from the global South. And you see some of the main fault lines of these different mobility conflicts, which also emerge around regions such as, you know, the South Africa or the Arabian Peninsula as well. So borders concern us in different ways, and they've also, to some extent, moved away from the border line, right? Scholars in border studies tend to speak about bordering practices, right? The disseminated practices, both within states and beyond their limits, through which the relations and the differential treatment of border is performed, if you will, right? So, you know, you have border guards checking passports across European space, say, for instance, in trains. You have as well, you know, even Italian officials argue that the borders of Europe are in fact south of Libya right now, right? And so the moment where migrants from the global South become illegalized in their mobility, which may be directed to Europe or not, expands ever further. But just as bordering practices seek to control migrants' entire trajectories, you know, border managers like to speak about integrated border management that operates before, at, and after the border. Well, we also see the emergence of forms of what we might call integrated border solidarity, i.e. practices of solidarity which they too operate along migrants' entire trajectories, even though this is not, you know, there's no central command, central agency for migrant solidarity. Effectively, our collective practices operate along migrants' entire trajectories. And, you know, if we are being criminalized today in so many different places, it's also because our practices of solidarity are in fact, effective in blocking border violence and limiting the violence of borders and their effects on the lives of migrants. I want to speak, if I have I don't want to be too long, but in a few more minutes, specifically about the Mediterranean frontier, which has been the focus of our work with forensic oceanography. And the Mediterranean frontier is, in fact, probably the most deadly border zone in the world, right? We're talking about more than 40,000 documented deaths at the maritime frontiers of Europe. And of course, many more deaths have gone unrecorded, leaving as only trace the haunting absence of these people for their families. Now, at sea, you have at work what we call a form of liquid violence, right? In a very simple and immediate sense. If you look at United Against Racism's list of death, as it is called, you'll see that for the majority of people who have died crossing the Mediterranean, the cause of death is in fact drowning. I.e., it is not, say, border guards shooting at migrants, right? Or any other form of direct violence perpetrated by border guards, but rather a form of indirect and mediated violence that turns the sea itself into a form of hostile environment for migrants. Now, a first way in which this is done is essentially policing formal and safe means of transport. You all know, I'm sure, that the Mediterranean is one of the arteries of global trade, right? And here you have some of the main shipping lines of trans-Mediterranean logistics that seek to make the movement of goods and certain privileged passengers as smooth as possible. But every port surrounding the Mediterranean is also shaped by what one might call a form of anti-logistics, i.e. a practice that seeks to make the movements of illegalized migrants the least smooth possible, right? To limit their movement, slow it down, make it more precarious. And as a result, migrants collectively have to form a kind of alternative transport infrastructure, which one might refer to as a form of alter logistics, a logistical network that is made as much by migrants' networks as actual means of transport, including, of course, the boats that migrants use to cross the sea, since they are denied access to safe and legal means of transport. Now, embarking on boats such as this one, migrants start to cross a space which is, in fact, one extended border zone, if you will, right? This is not, one thin line separating two states, but rather an expansive border zones extending over several hundred kilometers and actually crisscrossed by multiple overlapping jurisdictions, which you see, some of which you see indicated here. And in particular, what you see here indicated in red are search and rescue zones, the areas within which coastal states have the responsibility to coordinate rescue, right? However, as I'm sure you know, with rescue comes the obligation to disembark rescued passengers in a safe place. And in function of the Dublin regime, disembarkation entails responsibility for processing asylum claims. And so this has led coastal states to be, if you will, principally reluctant to operate rescue, and they've been criminalizing rescue at sea, whether by NGOs, but also fishermen and seafarers. And this has led to a number of cases of abandonment at sea, such as the first incident that we documented back in 2011, which we call the Left to Die boat case, an incident in which 72 people who had left the Libyan coast were abandoned to drift for 14 days in NATO's maritime surveillance area. And ultimately, when they landed back in Libya, only 9 people had survived. And so, since there was actually only this image for this incident that was available, a photograph taken by a French surveillance aircraft at the early stage of their journey, we had to piece together the testimonies of survivors, but also multiple sources of geolocated evidence, and in fact, bring the sea itself to testify for how it had been made to kill, as you see here with the drift model that an oceanographer produced for us based on wind and current data. We also relied on satellite imagery to detect the presence of large vessels that failed to bring themselves to the assistance of the drifting passengers. I can't go, of course, in detail into this project, but this report led to several cases in front of the courts of France, Belgium, Italy, and Spain, cases that in fact are still ongoing, and the lawyers hope to go in front of the European Court of Human Rights now that progressively almost all of the cases have been closed, and impunity has continued for this crime of non-assistance. But I just want to flag out in concluding that a crucial person in this incident, in fact, the only reason why anyone actually ever knew about it, was Father Zerai, who is an Eritrean priest based in Rome, in the Vatican, who for a number of years has basically operated alone, a one-man emergency phone line. You know, Father Zerai's number is written down on the walls of Libyan prisons, and he can be called at any time of the day or the night, say once when we were having dinner together, in fact. And the passengers on the Left to Die boat had called him, and Zerai tirelessly pressured Malta, Italy, NATO command to operate rescue, but to no avail at the time. And following this incident and several other incidents of abandonment at sea, a network that we founded decided somehow to collectivize Father Zerai's practice, to turn his one-man emergency hotline into a collective emergency network, the Watch the Med alarm phone that, of course, collaborates closely with Father Zerai and others across the Mediterranean. And so this is how the Watch the Med alarm phone, this alternative emergency infrastructure emerged, connecting more than 200 activists across Europe and North Africa to support migrants during their precarious journeys. I think I've been a little bit over time, and I apologize for that, but I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for that. I hope everyone can hear me okay, because my microphone has been lagging today. But with that, we're going to move on to Sanaz.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Sanaz, and I am a member of Unis versus Border Controls. Just to describe Unis versus Border Controls, Unis versus Border Controls, or URBC, was established in March of 2016, and so we've been going for over 4 years now. And we're basically a national campaign made up of migrant and British and EU lecturers, students, and activists. And our purpose is we're opposed to the hostile environment policy and border controls as exercised within UK higher education. And our manifesto basically is that we are obviously a free movement campaign. We believe in all types of free movement, not just free movement that is conceived of as just being around EU migrants. We're a free education campaign. We're against the marketization of higher education. We believe that all migrants matter. We don't ascribe to this model migrant discourse that you often see with some of the discussions made around migrants, or who is a deserving migrant and who isn't. We demand an end to all forms of border controls within all areas and all sectors. And this, of course, includes the NHS, where there is a migrant surcharge. That never used to be the case, but since 2015. And then again in 2017, upfront charges were put into effect for asylum seekers and undocumented migrants. So there is no free healthcare. And if you are an asylum seeker and undocumented migrant in this country, you'll have to pay for your medical care. And many undocumented and asylum seeker migrants are finding themselves dying because they can't get proper healthcare in this country. We also demand, and this is really fundamental, an end to the surveillance of students. And this includes, of course, the surveillance done by the attendance monitoring procedures, in addition to prevent. We also think that if migrant students or university staff members encounter immigration problems, the universities should be, and of course the student unions should be front and center in resisting immigration issues and the type of things that create immigration precarity or migrant precarity in higher education. And that, migrant students and university staff should be able to take legal recourse against their institutions without their precarious immigration statuses being used against them. And the last thing is that we demand that universities stop working with and or investing in the arms trade, fossil fuels, prison and border industries that are responsible for creating war, environmental devastation, and carceral violence that affects, in particular, working class, Black and Brown people all over the world, and also in the UK as well. So the work that we do as part of Unis versus Border Controls is 4 parts. We do things like workshops and educational outreach, like things like this event this evening. We have done a lot of resistance workshops where we describe what the hostile environment policy is, which I'll talk about later on in this discussion, but also how we can resist border controls and the hostile environment policy within our universities, but also in other sectors as well. We also provide casework support for migrant students and staff facing problems as a result of their immigration status. So that's what's been keeping us very busy in the last couple of months, and in particular during the COVID lockdown. We do research on the hostile environment in universities in November of 2019, well, a year ago, almost, not to this day, but kind of made close to the anniversary. We published our first study on the hostile environment policy in higher education, UK higher education, of course. And we're now concluding a study on COVID-19 technology and monitoring. We're looking at now the monitoring of students using things like AI apps and other forms of electronic monitoring, and of course things like online education, how that's actually furthering border controls and the hostile environment policy in UK higher education. And the last thing we do is working with other groups opposed to border controls is obviously protests and direct action. So we've done a lot of mutual work with organizations like, of course, Migrants and Culture, which is featured this evening, but also in deportations, Docs Not Cops, and the Anti-Race Network. So large group of people that we've worked with over the years that you can find on our website, which is obviously on the screen. So I've been talking a lot about hostile environment, and of course you might be thinking, what is hostile environment, and what is this thing how does border controls manifest itself in UK higher education? And it's really this. So when we talk about the hostile environment policy, we're really talking about border controls, that's obviously beyond what we consider as the natural borders, like, you know, when you come into the country, but it extends to basically everyday bordering in terms of migrants accessing housing, homelessness, homeless services, healthcare, schools, higher education, obviously, driving, bank accounts, work, and marriage. So basically, the intention of what we now consider the hostile environment policy that was enacted with the Immigration Acts of 2014 and 2016 was essentially to make the UK, quote unquote, a hostile place for undocumented migrants and asylum seekers in order to bring down net migration statistics. So basically, this policy turns British, EU, and even like migrants themselves into border police through either instituting gatekeeping practices, through the digitalization of personal data designed to locate quote unquote illegal migrants, or through encouraging people to report individuals to the Home Office who they suspect as being quote unquote illegal migrants. So that's basically what the hostile environment is. Now, in UK higher education, when we think about hostile environment, firstly, I want to just say that none of the policies we're talking about, whether it happens in higher education or elsewhere, there's always been border controls in the UK. There's always been xenophobic and racist policies. And this goes back to the Aliens Act of 1905 to, of course, what we consider now as the hostile environment. There's a whole slew of immigration policy that was designed to make it very difficult for migrants to be in the UK, to you know, obviously, you know, gatekeeping practices and accept those type of things that were designed to create a lot of precarity for migrant population. So none of this is new. And if we think about how border controls has been enacted in universities, we need to go back 10 years ago to the implementation of the points-based immigration system that came into effect under New Labour. So I'm sure some of you have heard in the media in the last couple of months of Boris Johnson wanting to create an Australian-style immigration system. Well, actually, New Labour did it first. And they did it between 2008 to 2010 with the implementation of the points-based immigration system. So we have different tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5. Now, tier 4 is obviously known as student visa route. So basically what universities had to do was, in order to sponsor international staff and students, they had to open their institutions up to attendance monitoring procedures, and obviously opening their institution to Home Office audits. That happens quite regularly. In some institutions it happens every 4 or 5 months, some institutions every year, but auditing does happen. And this meant that universities had to open themselves up to essentially border controls and heightened border policy. So with when the coalition government came into effect, and of course we all know what Theresa May said as Home Office Secretary, that she wanted to create a hostile environment policy, we tend to forget that type of language was very much embedded within Labour. You know, it was the MP for Immigration, Liam Brown, who actually coined the term hostile environment in a memo that was circulated around immigration policy, you know, in 2007. So none of these things are, you know, just, it's both political parties have played this xenophobic and racist discourse around immigrants. So when of course the coalition government came into effect, what they did in 2012 is they ended the post-study work visa scheme, and then of course they told universities that not only do you have to open your institution up to this very, you know, into more border controls and into more attendance monitoring procedures, but you also have to get in highly trusted sponsor status in order to, you know, be sure that you are the right institution to sponsor international students and staff. And so with that, in 2012, London Metropolitan University was one of the first universities to face this type of border controls. And this happened, of course, with they lost their HTS status, the highly trusted sponsorship status, and international students had 60 days to either find another institution to matriculate and to enroll in, or face administrative removal. So of course, you know, an institution like London Metropolitan University was targeted because it's a post-92 institution, it's a polytechnic, it has a high percentage of migrant students, but also migrant students of color who are Black, Muslim, and obviously working class. So it was really, the attack on London Metropolitan University was very much racialized, but it was an attack based on class. Of course, they would never have done this to a Russell Group institution, but they did target a post-92 institution. So it was highly political in terms of what the government was doing and how they were using basically their hostile environment policy to do this. Now, I don't want to get too much bogged into it, but I want to say that I know a lot of people always ask URBC, well, what institutions are good in terms of migrant students and are more benevolent, if you will, and which ones are a little bit more draconian. And I think that's a really wrong way of looking at it, because border controls encompass all universities. All universities have to ascribe to these type of policies in order, if they want to sponsor international students and staff. So it's not about which university is better, which university is worse, but it's like, how are these policies being used within your university to discipline and basically create more barriers for migrant students, particularly migrant students of color and migrant staff of color. I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing during COVID, during the first wave of COVID, and even now. So when we went to the first lockdown for COVID-19, this was the 23rd of March, URBC members were discussing ways in which we can give solidarity to migrant students who were having problems. And we realized that a lot of migrant students were going to have immeasurable problems simply because of no recourse to public funds. Now, I don't think many of you have heard about this, but no recourse to public funds basically means that if you're a Tier 4 student in the UK, you cannot get public funds. So, things like housing support or benefits of any type. So we decided to create a mutual aid fundraiser. And from the beginning of May until the middle of July, we gave out something like £6,000 worth of funds for students to be able to purchase groceries. And in some cases, we actually gave rent support to students. We had a lot of students contacting us, and we thought there was going to be a wave of students who would need this type of support financially, but we hadn't really anticipated how vast the problem was in terms of no recourse to public funds affecting Tier 4 students. We did a study with the Migrant Rights Network, and in July, or the end of July, we found that amongst the students who had taken the study, 56% of Tier 4 students were either destitute or at risk of facing destitution as a result of COVID-19. But of course, this really is around the fact that these students can't access support mechanisms because of no recourse to public funds. At the same time, a lot of these students were not only having problems keeping a roof over their head or being able to feed themselves, but the other problem is that because of COVID-19, their families either were in lockdown or had lost their jobs. So there was no way for students who were Tier 4 students, obviously international students, to be able to get funds in order to pay their tuition fees or even, to be able to survive in the UK. A number of students at a number of institutions have been effectively withdrawn off of their courses because they cannot pay their tuition fees. And if you're withdrawn off of your course, that means that affects your immigration status as a Tier 4 student. And if the university contacts the Home Office, that means your visa is curtailed and you have to leave the country. And if you fail to leave the country, then you're effectively an undocumented migrant in the UK and seen as an overstayer, which could have even further implications of, your rights in the UK, but also should you want to return back to the UK, this would have further repercussions in terms of your rights there. So at the moment, we have, as part of URBC, been doing a lot of work in sort of helping students who've been withdrawn off of their courses and fighting with universities to get these students back onto their courses, but also amplifying the issue around the fact that this is wrong and this should never happen. So in August of this year, we submitted 2 letters, one to Priti Patel, which was signed by over 560 lecturers, students, and union representatives, demanding an end to no recourse to public funds for Tier 4 students. And the second letter was sent to the Minister of Universities. Her name is Michelle Delaine. And this was signed by 530 lecturers, students, and union representatives. And our campaign is to demand for a tuition fee amnesty for Tier 4 students who are unable to pay for their tuition fees because of COVID-19 and because of the precarity that their families are in because of COVID-19. So these are some of the things that we've been doing. And if people are interested, they can obviously contact URBC and be a part of these campaigns. We have to understand, I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion around Tier 4 students these days. And I think there's this idea that any international student in the UK is rich or is wealthy. I mean, this is the kind of discourse that's paraded around media. But we have to understand that a lot of the students who come over are also part of a working class community or part of a lower middle class community. And they have gone under enormous debt to be able to come to the UK and be able to have, or enter into a British university and, get a degree from a British university. So when we think about, international students, I think we shouldn't really stop. We should really pause and think for a moment that this idea that international students are all wealthy and don't need our support, or the fact that border controls, that border controls happen in universities, or that these students, are seen as being wealthy, can ride the storm of the violence of border controls is quite wrong, because of the students that we come across who are by and large lower middle class or working class and under enormous debt. So I think when we think about joining up is to look at debt. And these are things that British students are dealing with at the moment. There's a lot of rent strikes happening and a lot of campaigns to stop the exploitation within higher education. So when we think about these type of things, we need to join up forces and looking at how debt is affecting people's ability to do things, and especially now under COVID-19. I think the last point I want to end on is that I think it is great that students are rising up against the exploitative environments within their universities. But at the same time, what is disappointing is that many of the students at a number of the rent strike campaigns are saying things like 9K for what? And this completely discounts the effect of marketized higher education systems and, of course, border controls on international students who not only have to pay anywhere between £11,000 to £25,000, depending on the courses they're on, but also very high visa fees and of course, the NHS surcharge fees. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds being spent in addition to accommodation cost and maintenance costs and everything else. And it's not about, using neoliberal logics to say, well, if I'm a student, I've spent all this money, I demand X, Y, and Z. Rather, it's about, all right, we have an exploitative higher education system, and the border controls are themselves exploitative and deadly. Rather, we should be joining up forces and talking about these issues and talking about the issues that international students are facing, in addition to home students, and linking up with the fact that both students are affected by debt economies and trying to push against this type of debt creation that's being done in both communities, and not looking as, well, like, I'm a student and I'm British and I spend $9,000 and the university's done me wrong. Of course, university has done you wrong, but think about what other students are facing and having those conversations and communicating those issues and talking about, demanding for free education, and not just like a reduced fee, but like actually demanding together free education, because it can happen, and talking about how border controls exist and demanding an end to border controls in our universities. And I think if students can channel this moment, to push for these type of policies and demand an end to the exploitation they face in these areas, then I think we can have an education system that is truly equal and truly decolonized in its entirety. So
thank you very much, Sanaz. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Shavir now, just because I want to make sure everyone gets time to introduce, and then some discussion as well.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm Xavier, or Zav for anyone who can't say my name properly. However you want to pronounce that, that's up to you. Thank you so much to Charles and Sanaz for those intros, because I think a lot of the groundwork that I was going to talk about is kind of done already in there, but also your work is inspirational, and all the power to you. We also know Unis Resist Border Controls with Migrants and Culture. We often collaborate on projects, and they are also part of our coalition of activists and cultural workers that I'll expand more a little bit later on. But so I'm just going to share. It's nothing too exciting. Well, maybe it is. I don't know. It's up to you to decide. I'm going to share a little bit of the work that we do in Migrants and Culture and how we started and why. So we kind of started about 2 years ago with Junlingo, kind of put a preliminary group or core group, as some will say, of migrant culture workers, including me and many others, who's kind of came together to look at how the policies of hostile environment were from the UK government were affecting the cultural sector. And as Sanaz said earlier, and very well, even though this is a policy that was implemented in 2012, I think it was, or a little bit before, by Theresa May, these issues already existed. What those policies have done is kind of heightened them systemically across the country. And we wanted to look at how that was affecting the cultural sector per se, because even though we as migrants and people who exist in the cultural sector understood that those things were affecting our presence and our ability to make work, our ability to participate in the cultural sector, and our ability to have our voices heard was being directly affected, we didn't have any, there was no available data or case studies or information that we could hold on to and shine a light on the problems that existed. So whenever we kind of, talk to someone saying, hey, this eligibility criteria is discriminatory, or there's visa issues here, or people are being discriminated because of their accents in getting roles, or shows are not being put on because they deem as anti-British or not British enough, that it was hard to kind of highlight that without proof. So that's kind of what we tried to do in a way. So our first job, I suppose, was to embark on a period of research and consultation across the sector. And we had consultations with a lot of people, people in a lot of capacity, that work in a lot of capacities within the sector. So we've had artists, curators, front of house staff, producers, security guards, students, technicians, and all that, kind of responding to our call outs and our consultations. And we introduced last year the outcomes and the first official data of across the sector of how the hostile environment is impacting us. Oh, actually, before we go into that, sorry, just jumping the gun a little bit on this. I just want to clarify that when we're talking about migrants and culture, we kind of we're not necessarily like a group that is looking at specific practice or a specific type of borders. We're kind of talking about very different types of borders, and we're talking about systems and how those systems are implemented. And when talking about borders, we're talking about not just physical borders, but judicial borders, racial borders, gender borders, ableist borders, class borders, economic borders, language borders, postcode borders, everyday borders across the sector. And I think that's essential to kind of understand the impact of the hostile environment, is because it's not just about a visa or people coming in and out of the country, which is highly essential for the viability of the sector as a whole, but it kind of permeates through every single aspect of our sector, every single aspect of interaction between members of our sector and members of our communities. That's how it operates. So it's not something that you can just point to, like, this line here is the hostile environment, this set of measures that kind of go across every single aspect of our lives. So the hostile environment in the cultural sector and its impact, you can access this document for free on our website, migrantsinculture.com. And it provided the first set of data, as I said earlier, the first set of data of that proves the impact of the hostile environment in the sector. You can go through it. There's a few things here that kind of contextualize the work that we've done and the outcomes. You can have access to our survey partners and contextualization of what the hostile environment is, which we're not going to go into now because our previous panelists have already kind of gave a lot of insights into it, but I want to kind of just highlight a few key findings from it. So some of the things that we already knew this, that people did not know in the cultural sector what the hostile environment was and how it operates, but here's some key findings of it. So for instance, 90% of cultural workers across the sector feel angry and or fearful about the hostile environment. 65% think daily or weekly about the hostile environment and its impact. 30% of migrant cultural workers feel disempowered within its sector. Since the launch of the hostile environment, both migrants and citizens of color are experiencing increased discrimination and hardship. And respondents to this consultation, 60% face discrimination of racial profiling, 58% face emotional distress, 51% encounter additional bureaucracy, 40% financial pressures, 38% reduced access to opportunities, and 38% having their right to work or study questioned. We also found other things, like there have been already 25% of migrant cultural workers want to leave the UK within the sector. 59% like people in positions of power. 59% of them lack any knowledge about the hostile environment. 55% lack resources or financial or otherwise to support migrant staff. And 58% lack organizational policies for migrant staff. And for us was kind of a bit of watershed moment, because we kind of started to look at what we could do within the sector to kind of provide change that supported not just migrant cultural workers, but primarily also looking at an intersectional understanding of migrant. So we're looking at people of color, LGBTQ plus people, also working class specifically, people on freelance contracts, disabled people, and many other categories that are most affected by these issues. So with the survey done and the outcomes published, we then kind of gathered a bunch of people. Oh, another thing that was jumping the gun again, was that we found out through this consultation that there is no legal definition of migrant in the UK. And this is a key finding for us, because it kind of allows us to understand how the government, and by the government, I do mean specifically this government, but also the previous governments, have used the lack of definition of migrant to be able to implement things like the hostile environment, or the deportation of during the Windrush scandal. In fact, the whole Windrush scandal, you can look at it from that prism, like who is a migrant and who is a citizen. If you don't define migration in this country, that basically leaves a gray area for you to operate however you want to when it comes to these issues. And we wanted to tackle that as well. So what we did was we gathered everyone together. We had over 100 people in a room back in January, and it was a way of workshopping ideas and workshopping through these findings and finding ways that collectively we can move forward and provide change within the sector. So from that, we then start to establish partnerships. So Unis Resist Border Controls are one of them. And we also work with other migrant-led organizations from other sectors, not just ours, but also in our sectors, such as Migrants in Theatre, who do brilliant work as well. And other kind of activist groups, as well as unions like PCS and UVW or ITC, and also kind of thinkers and researchers and people from across the sector that on leadership positions. So we've also worked with Oval House Theatre, Live Theatre, Contact Theatre in Manchester, East Street Arts in Leeds. And so we've kind of tried to branch out as thinking about the sector as a whole, rather than just people who make theatre every now and then or performance every now and then. From that, we this year, we've kind of tackled three main things that I'll kind of very succinctly go through them. One of them was a set of 12 proposals for cultural sector recovery for migrants. And within the definition of migrants, we obviously branch into other categories, the intersectional categories of migrants. And
Xavier, I'm very sorry. I just wanted to check if it's okay to wrap up in a minute or so we could go into a discussion. It's all very interesting, so I feel very bad interjecting.
No, it's fine. I'll be super quick. I just need to touch on this point and the next one as well, if that's okay. So the cultural sector recovery for migrants is a set of proposals that companies, organizations, and migrant cultural workers can implement within their structures that will help combat the hostile environment policies across the sector, not just within their own companies. And it's all very laid out. It also includes a proposed definition of migrants within the cultural sector from our perspective. And I would highly recommend everyone to kind of download this and take some time on with it and engage with it from the companies that you're working from, and also with companies that you're working with. Alongside this set of recovery proposals, we also launched an initiative against the Festival of Brexit, or Festival UK 2022, which is the old Brexit festival proposed by Theresa May and is now being appropriated by the current government to launch in 2022 with all 4 nations involved. And this initiative is still going, and this week has been quite prominent in the press and across the sector, because there's been a lot of conversation about what the purpose of this festival is, the nationalism around it, and the impact that it will have and is already having on our sector. And also kind of proposes specifically this, which is really the last point that I want to touch on, is that we're not just rebelling against this festival. We're kind of looking at this, the money that is being spent on this festival, as a way that we can use that money to propose systemic change in this systemic change up on. During this pandemic, our sector has been completely decimated, and all the proposals that from the government have been towards organizations, most of them who already don't need that level of support. However, hundreds of thousands of people have been left with no support or jobs or way to have decent living in the UK. So what we propose is a set of initiatives to reappropriate the 120 million spent on this festival, and to ring fence that money, and for the arts councils of all 4 nations, together with unions and representatives of the most affected cultural workers, to establish a cultural recovery fund that is kind of a way of trying out a basic income type model for cultural workers for the future. So I could go on for another hour or so. There's loads more to talk about, but I'll wrap it up there for the sake of time.
Thank you so very much, Xavier, and thank you to all of you for your presentations. I feel like a nagging presence, just telling everyone to wrap it up. And I really don't want to do that, because everyone's work is so important and contributes so much. But I think we will be able to dwell further into how your works and your projects intersect as well through discussion. So it's really quite tricky, because what you've provided is such a rich and such an expansive body or bodies of work that, you know, I'm really thinking, how do I ask questions in a way that really honors that work and doesn't just kind of dilute it and doesn't really flatten it? So it is quite tricky. It's a sentiment to your work, but I think something that I personally have been thinking about a lot, and especially in lockdown, with all of us, you know, having a bit more time to slow down simply because nothing is happening, and catch up on some reading. What I have been reading is actually, I was kind of going back to some historical reading from my parents' history, around the time of totalitarian communist regimes in the USSR and so on, and linking that to some of the practices currently used by governments. I came across a quote which somehow it seemed to me quite poignant and quite relevant about how we kind of struggle with and struggle against political systems of oppression now. So I'd just like to read it and then pose my question against it, if that's okay. So Václav Havel writes in Power of the Powerless: "If I say genuine political work, I have in mind the kind of thought and conceptual work that has freed itself of all the traditional political schema that have been imported into our circumstance from a world that will never return, and whose return, even were it possible, would provide no permanent solution to the most important problems. For example, is it possible to talk seriously about whether we want to change the system or reform it? In the circumstances under which we live, this is a pseudo problem, since for the time being, there is simply no way we can accomplish either goal. We are not even clear about where reform ends and change begins," end quote. So I guess to wrap the question up, but also open it up at the same time, in a time when we've seen such a hyper-globalization and yet consolidation of power, how do you navigate this? And for all of you, where do the lines of political work, research work, and just everyday personal work begin? And where do they begin to disrupt? So it's quite an open question. Perhaps I'll throw it out to any of you who'd like to take it first, and then you're very welcome to kind of bounce that off each other as well.
I think it's a big question, because I don't think there is like a right answer for it in many ways. Like systems are too complex and too wide for us to kind of have one way of going about it. I think just to touch on that, like for instance, it's incredibly difficult to look at how the context of globalism or globalization, as you put it very well, and kind of see where you can start tackling it, right? Because it all feels super big and super monogamous and not really accessible for anyone at the bottom of things. However, for instance, like, just because it's on my mind right now, like the stuff about the legacy of this festival that we're talking about, and like this festival comes out at the end of a legacy of loads of similar kind of projects, and you've had things recently like the Olympics, for instance, which is a not necessarily an intentionally nationalist project like this one is, but it does have globalist and nationalist connotations to it. I think the main way that you can continue to kind of try to dismantle these things is think about it on, like, there is political influence, there is way more nuances that we can ever put light to. But as a group of activists and researchers and citizens, I think it's important for us to continue to shine a light on them, so that it becomes impossible for the conversation to be navigated away from. Do you know what I mean? I think also, just to touch on a thing that you said, like how can I make a change as an individual? And I hope that we can start looking at these issues as structural issues and collective issues, because you are not just an individual, and this, for instance, this festival is not a consequence of one person, not the responsibility of one person. It's a collective endeavor, I think we need to remember that, because we are, and maybe this is my left-leaning mindset thinking about it, but we are members of communities, and those communities have responsibility and have power. And perhaps the biggest issue with globalism is how we tackle the individualism of our societies, I suppose, and think about them as collectives and collective representations of things. So yeah, I think like from your really broad question, I think that those are the main kind of things that spring up straight away. And I don't want to take too much of a time, because I could be here for 2 hours thinking about that question and globalism and how it transpires to where we are right now, really.
Well, I think you have opened up the question really nicely, both for Sanaz and Charles. So either of you are very welcome to respond, and also ask each other questions if that's what you'd like to do. So Sanaz or Charles, whoever would like to take it up first.
I'll let Charles go first. Do you want to add anything?
Oh, Charles, your mic is off.
Yeah, unmute.
Excuse me. Yeah, first let me say I really enjoyed listening to you, Sanaz and Xav, and I think there's something really interesting in the way the organizers of the event kind of put our voices and perspectives together, because, you know, I think in this way we really see the way borders operate at very, very different scales and in different modalities, right? So, I mean, we've kind of shifted from the geopolitical scale, the scale of an entire border zone of the Mediterranean, to the way borders are disseminated within cities, across public and private institutions, crisscross our daily lives. So, you know, I think it's really powerful the way, you know, in bringing our voices together, you allow us to see this much more clearly. Another question that maybe intersects here is that of hostile environments, right? I mentioned that briefly as well in my own talk. And this is something that's been very interesting for myself, and in fact, even more so for my colleague, Lorenzo Pizzani, who's been writing about this. Of course, hostile environments, you know, you both described this policy very specifically, but you can also look at it as a concept, as an approach to government, right? That can be used to think about bordering practices beyond the UK, beyond British institutions and cities. And again, thinking about the Mediterranean, but also think about the Sahara, think about the Alpine frontiers. These are all areas which are being turned into hostile environments through restrictive bordering policies. And here you can really start to see at work what we can think with Michel Foucault as a form of environmentality, a form of government by modulating, if you will, the environment. And the environment, not only, you know, as the natural backdrop, say, you know, forests or whatever, but, you know, the environment as something that transgresses completely the boundaries between nature, culture, technology, etc. So that's just, you know, a first kind of general comment, and something that I get from listening to you, Sanaz and Xav, and that's I'm grateful for the organizers for allowing us to see by bringing our voices together. I wanted to come back to your question, Alex, and maybe that connects to something, in fact, it was in the title of my presentation, but I didn't really get a chance to mention. I'm more interested, let's say, thinking of borders as lines. Of course, borders are still lines that separate, and that still, of course, matters, right? But I'm more interested in thinking about borders as front lines, areas of conflict, if you will. And those front lines are constantly moving. They're not you know, forever at the same place, right? Simply because borders, in fact, how should I say, they are co-constituted by between borders themselves, bordering practices, and the migrants who cross them. this is in fact really simple. You know, without borders, there would be no migrants, right? And without migrants crossing borders, without border guards policing those crossings, borders would not really come into any tangible existence. They wouldn't mark themselves in our imaginaries in the same ways, right? So borders also come into existence through their very transgression. And borders are constantly transformed, pushed to evolve by migrant practices. So I'm interested in not so much in the border line, but in the front line of the mobility conflict, where new practices of violence are evolving, but also where new practices of resistance are emerging. And again, this is constantly evolving. It's evolving in the Mediterranean, but it's evolving also in UK cities and public institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And last, I was really inspired by the way Sanaz, you mentioned, and in fact also you, Xav, you mentioned somehow multiple borders. And Sanaz, you mentioned the idea that around student debt, there is a kind of possible convergence and alliance. And those are very much those moments of alliance where various conditions and subjects can suddenly come together. Those are very much some of the most interesting front lines of resistance.
Thank you so much, Charles. But unfortunately, I don't see it happening. But it's not to say that it can't happen. And with the protests that are happening at a number of university campuses, I'm based in Manchester, so I see what's happening at the University of Manchester, which has been in the news for the last couple of days. But unfortunately, I think that students only see it as, you know, what's happening within their silos and not necessarily joining up. And I think that's the real problem. I think to even talk about what Xav mentioned, Migrants and Culture did an amazing research project also on how the hostile environment policy affects those within the cultural sector. And we actually had very similar statistics, because URBC, when we did our study, we found that at least I would say a good majority, if not over half, of UK university lecturers had no idea about the hostile environment and how it manifests itself in higher education. So, you know, you have at least 52% of lecturers in this country who don't understand hostile environment. And I have to say, even amongst EU lecturers and students, a lot of them didn't understand how hostile environment. And of course, Zav's right now shaking his head. So he understands, you know, exactly that this is a real problem in terms of people understanding the hostile environment. On the other hand, and I think it's really important to bring this up, because you have a lot of, I mean, you know, Charles, you brought this up, but there's a lot of, you know, there's within the migrant sector, there's a huge NGO sector. And it really pushes policies sometimes actually to the detriment of migrants themselves. And so you have an NGOification of migrant rights, which I think does really hamper a very left-wing resistance that, you know, URBC is advocating for. On the other hand, you have, you know, things like University of Sanctuary, which has become very popular in the last couple of years as in response to Calais and the quote unquote refugee crisis. There's always been a refugee crisis. It never just is like 1 year, but it came in response to that. So you have a lot of universities that are investing in this whole practice of sponsoring 1 or 2 refugee students. And a lot of people take pride in that within the university sector, not realizing that, of course, they're also complicit in practicing and pushing border policies and of course the hostile environment policy. But as URBC, we know that, you know, the tools of bordering are also created in universities. The discourse around justifying borders is created in universities. So this idea that universities are some level of a safe space against borders, I think is just so, it's so wrong. It's also something that we have to constantly talk about to people, that your institutions are either investing in border and prison technologies or either you know, justifying the discourse around bordering. and why we need borders. So I think it's around pushing against those type of things within the academy. And that's, I think, something that gets left out so much. When we talk about a hostile environment, and as Charles brilliantly said, it's not about one location of hostile environment or the actual policy of hostile environment we talk about, but it's these many other manifestations of hostile environment policy. And this is why, as part of URBC, we say borders kill knowledge. Borders kill people, but they kill, they create the knowledge that kills, or, it stops and prevents the type of discussions that need to happen because of the bordering policies that are in effect.
Yeah.
Sanaz, actually, just after your introduction, there was definitely a joke forming back in the back of my head, or not necessarily a joke, but a quote by Mark Fisher, which was that there's nothing worse than New Labour. There used to be nothing worse than New Labour until the Tories came in, and there's a question. Oh, go on.
Can I just say something about that New Labour quote, and also just touch on a couple of things that Sanaz and Charles said? The New Labour quote is actually quite an interesting one, because Tony Blair said himself that it was his duty to continue with Margaret Thatcher's policies, and also Margaret Thatcher then later said that her biggest achievement had been New Labour. So those just kind of highlight the situation there. But I kind of just wanted to reflect a little bit on what Sanaz was saying, because I think there's so many big parallels with between the cultural sector and the university sector. They often feed each other in many ways, and they support each other in many ways as well, but they're also in conflict in many ways. But I think what is interesting is how state-wise, a lot of the times universities and the cultural sector, which are meant to be education and culture, are meant to be are perceived as paramount of left-wing thinking, right? Or at least they're perceived like that. But institutionally and historically, they've both been two sectors that have been used as ways of border patrolling or border enforcing. In a way, how that manifests in the cultural sector is also with visa restrictions and things like that, but also on the use of cultural value as a way of forming an agenda, of washing an agenda of its perceivably bad intentions and framing it as a good thing. You've had that throughout history, not just in this country, but across the world, as you said very well earlier on, how propaganda kind of gets seeped into and creates further divisions because it portrays itself as a unifying figure within the sector, but actually what it's doing is discriminalizing against many others. So in that way, and also to touch on this borders as frontlines, as Charles was saying, which I think is a really interesting way of looking at it. And how can we kind of fight against these things is about thinking about them as also as front lines. Because I think that's how, if you think of yourself, think about it in the cultural sector as a member of the cultural sector, then you have a line that you shouldn't cross, right? And perhaps what you can do is you can take away your labor from projects or from propositions like nationalistic campaigns that the government puts forward. You can read up about what is happening and put your foot down and kind of, align yourself with activist groups and kind of projects like URBC or Migrants and Cultures or whatever. But also you can withdraw labor, you can continue to spotlight, and you can engage in conversations with people within the sector who are around you, who kind of go, I don't understand this, why is this a problem? And kind of go, hey, here it is. The most you can do is give information to people. Then if within the information, if they have that information and they continue to not want to acknowledge it, then you withdraw your labor. That's what I would suggest to people. And make sure you tell them why.
I have a question from Rachel Johnson in the audience, which beautifully intersects a question I was going to ask myself. So I'm going to give myself that liberty of merging those questions together. So building on the discussion of the festival UK 2022, that's the same pro-Brexit festival that we are discussing, and alternative practices. How can we use culture to create powerful or empowering coalitions between migrants and the so-called citizens, i.e. those recognized by the state, in order to create structural change? And I say this is very similar to my question because my question was off the back of that Mark Fisher or Tony Blair quote, and it was simply, how do we bring back political hope? So is it okay if I actually give that one to Charles first, because I feel that it's Charles's turn?
No. I feel that last time Sanaz put me on the hot seat.
True.
So now it's your turn, Sanaz.
That now is
you take up that difficult one.
I mean, you know, I think for URBC, for example, we would love it if people that are cultural producers can work with us, because we're you know, a national campaign. We're made up of, you know, different people in different cities. And, you know, we're also, you know, I'm not teaching full time, but of course there are people that are doing full-time teaching. And as we all know, with the Zoomification of higher education at the moment with the global pandemic, it's a lot of work. So, I mean, you know, join us. You know, if you have a great idea of how do we disseminate this information in a better way, in a more inclusive way, in a way that, you know, reaches a wider audience, then I think it's around, you know, hi, I have these, you know, these skills, and I like your work, and I want to be able to, you know, reach out to more people. So here's something that I can do for you. And I mean, that would be so appreciated at this time, especially because we're so swamped with cases at the moment. So I think it would be really helpful, and it would actually, you know, take the weight off of our shoulders of having to do everything, you know, all the time ourselves. So maybe that's one way of doing it, is offering your services, you know, and I think that would be amazing if that could be done.
I mean, I can jump in, or would you like to go ahead, Xav?
Oh, I mean, I can. I was just going to.
Yeah, go ahead.
A similar thing that Sanaz was said, and kind of jump on it, which is, you know, I think you have to think about these problems as systemic and structural. So in order to combat them, you need intersectional support. Like for instance, cultural sector is not a monolithic thing, right? There's a lot of things that intersect within it. So it makes no sense for us to kind of do the investigations and the activism that we do with just looking at people who work within the cultural sector. This is why we partner with activist groups, other migrant-led organizations from other sectors, unions, and you know what I mean? So you have to think about it, not just how it affects you directly, but what the context of what it is where you operate in, and where you can find information that is also not always available in your own sector or within your own sphere. So you have to think about it intersectionally, and you have to also think about that the issue of borders is not just a migrant issue, it's a class issue, and it's a racial issue, it's a gender issue. You know, it's a sexuality issue. And I think you have to think about these things like that in the prism of where they sit in the world, and not just as an act of movement, but as an act of engaging and living respectfully. That's what you have to think about, I think.
That was really inspiring. You know, I think the first thing I would want to highlight is somehow our power. The power of migrants, even the most, you know, precaritized. You know, I don't want to idealize. I'm well aware of the horrendous suffering. But, you know, I talk to people who attempt to cross the sea 8 times, right? I mean, talk about lessons in determination. Yeah. You know, we're talking about a few thousand people who arrive on European shores, people who have lost everything, who have nothing else than the clothes on their backs. And yet these frail bodies are generating political crises within some of the most powerful states in the world, right? I mean, when you think about it, that's really stunning, actually. The power of those frail bodies, right? Who are refusing the global apartheid. They're refusing to be assigned in space and denied of their freedom and of their rights. But also I want to think of the power of our solidarity practices. Again, if we're being criminalized, it's because we're powerful, because we're effective. So I think it's really, really important to see that, you know, as small as our interventions and you know, localized our interventions are, they're actually part of this broader chains of integrated border solidarity, as I like to call them. It means that if we consider that borders are overdetermined and again are shaped by class, race, gender, well, every time we lead anti-racist lives in our daily existence, the violence of the Mediterranean border vacillates, right? These different scales are deeply interconnected. And just, you know, to conclude, I've been, you know, writing a bit recently about the EU's new pact for migration and refugees. Really, in fact, a new European pact against migrants and refugees, a pact between European states to keep migrants out, and which has been drafted without consulting migrants themselves. Now, this pact is bound to perpetuate the mobility conflict, the human suffering, the political conflicts that it generates structurally, and it really shows us that the EU has lost any, you know, remainder of capacity for political imagination. And I think it's high time that we demonstrate that we are able not to only to be on the defensive, as someone else is writing in, I think Matthew Abbey writes in the chat, but also able to formulate powerful alternative visions that might lead us out of the current impasse.
I think we are ready to lead on to our closing question. Thank you all so much for all these answers. And how do I wrap up such an interesting and lively conversation? I think I wanted to touch on a question that refers, as Sanaz was saying, to the academy and is reflective and critical of the academy right now. So I think that's probably the question I will go for. I was just thinking about how we were talking of the power of individual migrants. I always remember Behrouz Bouchani, who was a collaborator of actually one of our panelists from a talk last year, a panelist called Arash Sarvastani, an Iranian filmmaker who collaborated with Behrouz on a film about a refugee detention center. And what's quite interesting to me is how, while we do this kind of work, what you have to be wary about is making sure the work doesn't get co-opted. And I think there's a link there between that iPhone that was being smuggled into that refugee camp to make that documentary for me, and the Zoomification, as Sanaz was saying, of our society. And I think the link is that we actually now witness everything, and you would have thought it would have led to an increase in empathy, but that is not always the case. And actually sometimes our conversations get co-opted. So our own university, for example, to bring it back, has basically argued that what it's doing right now with the Zoomification is actually much fairer to international students, and in some way it's a utopia. So once again, I think I am the queen of nagging our panelists and also creating huge open-ended questions. But I'm wondering, as our closing remarks, can you reflect on the co-option of work? How do you kind of prevent your work being co-opted, or when you see it being co-opted, how do you react? Because we talked about being creative, but now that is in some way being preventive, right? So whoever would like to take this one first.
Shall we say with you, Zaf? Because I think I went, and then maybe you, and then, yeah?
No, I don't know how to answer it. No, it's okay. I think how to prevent co-opting. I think and sometimes, most of the times you can't, but if you catch someone, basically, I think you have to think about your work, where you put your work, in what contexts, and who you engage with. That's the first thing. I think I remember Sheila Gilani, who's an amazing performance maker and a creative mind, has this thing on her website, which is Tactics of Care, I think is what she calls it. And basically, it's a series of questions that she asks herself whenever she starts a new project. Or and those are about, like, what impact will this project have locally? Can I work with local people? Can I contract local people to operate with in this project? Is this project going to have impact on my mental health? Is this project going to have impact on people that I work with mental health? And for instance, we started to adapt those questions to I say a collective that I used to be part of, sorry. We started to think about when we operate and when we operate within the cultural sector, how is our work being impacted by the context of where it's presented in? Who is it in with, and where is it going to go and be shown at? And who is contracting us to make this project, to make this work? What lines of distribution are going to go forward? Do the people who we're working with for this project have affiliations with people who we don't want to have affiliations with? So I think looking at the structures that you're engaging in is paramount, so that you're not just in terms of your creative work actually being properly contextualized, but also in terms of who you're engaging with and who you're giving power to.
Thank
and
you
how
so
you're
much,
thinking
Sam.
about making the work.
Thank you. And there's a
That's
question.
kind of,
oh, so sorry.
no, it's fine. I've lost my train of thought now. Sorry.
Oh no, I'm very sorry about that. I was just thinking to answer the question of one of our attendees, who is the artist you're speaking about? Because I think someone wants to get that as a reference.
Me?
Yeah, you mentioned a performer.
Oh, Sheila Gilani.
Thank you.
I think it's like that. Oh gosh, she's gonna kill me if I get it wrong. I'll put it in the chat later when someone else is talking. So I think that that's the first thing that I would say, because you can't really control that much once the work is out there, who's going to appropriate language and who's that. I think if you catch people appropriating stuff that you're using or taking your work out of its context, and like it's happening with the Brexit Festival, you know, that sort of language and formation of language around a thing that is toxic and violent, but to be perceived as beneficial for communities, you have to really counteract it and put a spotlight on the problems that it's doing and the systems that it's creating, which is what we're trying to do with our opposition and open letter with against the Brexit Festival, for instance. But I have a quote here as well, which I think it kind of goes more a bit, it's a quote that I'm quite in love with actually recently, and I think it really kind of accentuates this in a way, or the approach to how to make work that might be taken out of context, and how you can navigate that, I suppose. It's a very small quote, so don't worry. What is the impossible? Who decides what's impossible? This was being asked by striking workers in 1968, and we must continue to ask it today, every day, in the overlapping worlds of life and work, whenever our voices can be heard. How can the impossible be demanded when what is deemed possible is not even remotely adequate to address the catastrophic world we are creating? We should not be worried about biting the hand that feeds us, as it is our money that is being used. We should instead eat the hand, for it is a delight. The hand is much, much tastier than the boot. And this is a quote by Tashini, who is one of the people in the collective that kind of distributed their award, the Tate Award, across all of them. And I think it kind of is a sort of a mindset to think about who you're working with and how, and are you collaborating or are you just working for them? You know, that's the last thing I want to say.
Maybe I can, Sanaz, unless you want to go, maybe I can pick up on some of that reflexivity and sensitivity to context with a little anecdote, in fact. I started when I was a student in an art school in Switzerland, where I'm actually still speaking from Switzerland here. I started doing a documentary film with people who had been illegalized. And the aim of this shift in Swiss policy at the time was, it was stated black on white, to illegalize people who were requesting for asylum so that they disappear here or elsewhere, right? It was really the idea of disappearance. And actually, I won't go too much in detail into this anecdote, but the authorities in a small city had done this incredible political mistake. You know, instead of putting people onto the streets on a case-to-case basis, they had emptied a whole asylum seeker center on one day and created a collective against them. And so in that city, it was the first place where this category of rejected asylum seekers were becoming visible and claiming their rights, etc. And the film followed them as they, you know, showed their strategies of survival as parts of this campaign contesting the shift in asylum policy. So that was back in 2005, right? Documenting and denouncing the conditions of survival that illegalized migrants were reduced to as a result of the shift in policy. 2007, Switzerland, in collaboration with the EU, funds a campaign by the International Organization for Migration, targeting Western African countries, in particular Cameroon and Nigeria, which stages a fictionalized representation of a young Black migrant living on the streets in an unidentified European city, begging for money, being chased by the police, and lying to his family, telling them that he's going to university and that everything is fine, right? So basically, Switzerland was funding an information campaign that was spectacularizing the precaritization of migrants' fates and using it as a deterrent, right? Clearly, the shame that we hope to inflict on the Swiss authority had clearly reached its limits, right? They were spectacularizing the very conditions that we had sought to uncover. Right? Now, I think you can imagine how I felt when watching those video clips. And for a time, I decided to stop producing images of migration and interrogate instead the migration of images themselves and look at that practice of, in fact, what the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which is rather an organization against migration, that practice which itself labeled perception management, right? There are various tools of migration management. As part of that, there's this idea that they can manage migrants' perception to deter them from ever seeking to leave their countries and reach Europe. So this is a slightly long anecdote, but I'm just trying to underline the ambivalence of whatever we put out into the world, the reflexivity that is necessary, and the way we can try to, you know, shift our tactics, if you will, in response.
I think I'll end actually. I think it's really important that people always maintain their critical thinking skills. I think sometimes, generally speaking, I've seen that people just sort of it falls by the wayside when people talk about certain organizations or certain things. And you have to understand that, you know, you need to always retain your critical thinking skills, and particularly in terms of how discussions around decolonization are being employed by a number of universities while they maintain border controls, they invest in border controls and prisons and borders and all types of systems of oppression that directly affect working class communities, directly affect migrant communities, Black people, not just in the UK, but nationally, like globally around the world. And I think it's, you know, up to the students, and of course I don't know if there's any staff on this this conference, but I think it's important for you to start to think about those things and not sort of say, well, right, let's push for this decolonizing agenda when it might be a very watered down neoliberalized function that does very little and actually oppresses even more people. So I think it's around that sort of discussion that needs to happen. And unfortunately, sometimes I think people's knee-jerk reaction is to say, yes, great, decolonizing, wonderful, and not think of how a university is instrumentalizing it in ways that actually creates more precarity for people. And also realize this, that the people that are going to be pushing and decolonizing the agenda are not going to necessarily be paid for it. So you have a lot of staff who are predominantly women, queer, Black, and POC who are going to be having to implement decolonizing policies but are never paid for their labor. So I think about those things, but also think about the function of how this discourse is being used by the university and then push against it. That is what you need to constantly be doing. I mean, we do it as part of URBC. I know that our voices have been co-opted a number of times by NGOs, but we always say, right, this is where an NGO is trying to push for themselves, but they also are doing it for funding purposes. We're not funded by anybody. We don't have, where our voices are not compromised that way, but hear it out from people that are experiencing this type of violence and are working to protect people who are also facing similar violence as well. So I'll end it on that note.
Thank you all so much. It has been incredible. And I think I can speak for everyone when we say that it was just really revealing to hear about your work and what you do and the synergy of the conversation as well. Thank you as well to all our attendees this evening. Thanks for joining us. It was great to have you here as the audience. So yes, Sanaz, Xavier, and Charles, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming along.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much for having us.
I learned a lot from all of you and I really enjoyed it. So thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Likewise.
And the attendees are saying thank you as well.
I could have been another hour, and I think we've had enough material to talk about for another hour at least.
It's always very difficult, I know. Yeah. Hugely appreciated. All the best, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.